Though they'd grow more complex over time, Quentin Tarantino's debut feature Reservoir Dogs is still absolutely rich with detail. And so, just as we're doing with the rest of Tarantino's filmography, today we're going to jump into the finer details found in Reservoir Dogs and look at a few things that you might have missed, even if you've been rewatching this movie over and over again for the past 30 years. So with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 18 things you somehow missed in Reservoir Dogs. Number 18, related characters. As with just about every Quentin Tarantino movie, there are of course connections in Reservoir Dogs with the other films that Tarantino has made. Of course, the most famous connection is that Vic Vega, played here by Michael Madsen, is actually the brother of Vincent Vega, played by John Travolta, in Pulp Fiction. However, another familial connection that might not be as obvious concerns the Nash family. See, Marvin Nash is one of the few characters whose full name is revealed throughout Reservoir Dogs, and can be connected to the unseen, sort of, Gerald Nash, another boy in blue from Natural Born Killers. Along with the not-so-well-liked Seymour Scagnati, Vic Vega's parole officer, and his brother, Natural Born Killers' Jack Scagnati, there is one more sibling pairing. This once again connecting Reservoir Dogs to Pulp Fiction. See, Mr. White from Reservoir Dogs is actually the brother of Jimmy Dimmick, played by Tarantino, in Pulp Fiction. So yeah, apparently Jimmy just chose to ignore the fact that Mr. Wolf looks exactly like his dead brother, but hey, who said this had to make exact sense? It's just cool. Number 17, zero female presence. Quentin Tarantino is no stranger to bringing to life strong, compelling female characters, but there are none to be seen in his first effort. Throughout Reservoir Dogs, there's not one single female character outside of the woman who puts the bullet in Mr. Orange's gut, and not a single word spoken by a female character at all. Things of course changed just 2 years later with the release of Pulp Fiction, but for all intents and purposes, Reservoir Dogs is a total boys club. Number 16, who is True Blue? Tarantino, of course, has a knack for creating iconic opening sequences, and Reservoir Dogs' breakfast scene is definitely up there with the best. While discussing Madonna's work, the group ponders who exactly is True Blue. The song itself references Madonna's feelings for her then husband Sean Penn, however, the reference in the movie goes a little bit deeper than that. At the beginning, the men sit around asking which one is True Blue, while in just a few hours' time, they'll all be asking the very same question again, this time trying to figure out which of these very same men wears the blue of the police force. Number 15, Eddie doesn't talk about Madonna. As the group of men sit around talking about Madonna's work, there is one guy who is suspiciously absent all the way throughout the exchange. With so much dialogue being shot back and forth between these characters, it might be easy to miss the fact that nice guy Eddie doesn't say a word during the entire Madonna conversation. Which is a bit strange because usually he's quite a chatty guy. However, his omission in this conversation has nothing to do with his character in the movie or the narrative at large, but actually the actor playing Eddie. The character is played by Chris Penn, brother of Sean Penn, who, as I just said, was married to Madonna at one point. So in this scene, out of respect for his former sister-in-law, the actor just chose to be silent. Number 14, Mr. Orange ratted out Mr. Pink. Outside of Madonna, one of the first subjects in Reservoir Dogs to get a proper lengthy debate is the concept of tipping, and specifically Mr. Pink's refusal to do so, even when it's just $1 he's asked to kick into the pot. In this scene, Joe offers to pay for the meal so as long as his crew cover the tip, though when he returns to the table, he's $1 short. And when he asks who hasn't chipped in, Mr. Orange immediately points the finger at Mr. Pink. Now at the time, this doesn't really require too much thought. You might just assume that the men have respect for Joe and are trying to rat out Mr. Pink because, I mean, who doesn't tip $1 when everyone else is throwing in? However, this does have a deeper meaning because, of course, it's Mr. Orange who, without hesitation, immediately rats out Mr. Pink because, of course, he himself is the undercover police officer that they eventually try to finger. Number 13, the advert for Jackrabbit Slims. Mr. Blonde's death scene is of course one of the most memorable parts of the entire movie, and no doubt the one that people have rewatched over and over again. However, even with that in mind, there is one detail that slips most viewers by. And that's right after the iconic track Stuck in the Middle with You ends on the radio playing in the scene, we get a very brief advert for Jackrabbit Slims. Jackrabbit Slims is, of course, the 50s diner in which Vincent Vega, the dying Mr. Blonde's brother, danced with Mia Wallace in Pulp Fiction. And what's even more impressive about this detail is that Jackrabbit Slims as a thing doesn't even show up on screen until Pulp Fiction, which was released 2 years after this movie. Number 12, Mr. Blonde's drink. Another link between Tarantino's first two movies is a shared trait between Vic Vega and Jules Winfield. Now the two, of course, are connected with Winfield working with Vic's brother Vincent, but it turns out they're also linked by the fact that they both enjoy drinking a tasty fast food beverage, and both choose to do it in strikingly similar ways. Now while there's no official confirmation that Vic in fact got his drink from Big Kahuna Burger, it is a good shout. I mean, where else is he gonna get it from? 2 years later, Jules made the fictional franchise iconic, of course, while eating and drinking Brett's meal, but Vic did it first. Number 11, the real function of the warehouse. The majority of Reservoir Dogs, of course, takes place in a warehouse that the team uses as their rendezvous point. However, there are a few details in the set dressing that suggest that this is a far more morbid setting than just a regular old warehouse. While interesting set design in their own right, the hearse and the coffins are also nothing short of perfect foreshadowing for the fact that only one man that entered the warehouse on screen would ultimately leave it alive, and even then probably was killed soon afterwards. Number 10, who is Marcellus Spivey? While some Tarantino-verse connections seem quite obvious, others are a little bit more of a stretch and aren't really confirmed, but still, they're fun to talk about. And one of these comes in Reservoir Dogs, with the dropping of a name that doesn't really have any weight in this movie, but will retroactively once Pulp Fiction came out. See, one of the main and certainly most influential characters in Tarantino's second movie is Marcellus Wallace. He's a powerful gangster at the center of all three of that flick's chapters, but he may have already been mentioned in Reservoir Dogs under the name Marcellus Spivey. Now, Marcellus isn't the most common name in the world, so who's to say that these aren't the same characters with swapped out last names? Hey, let's go one step further. Maybe the Marcellus that sold Larry's diamonds before going to prison for 20 years escaped, changed his name to Marcellus Wallace, and then moved into the narcotics game away from shifting stolen ice. Is it a bit of a stretch? Probably, but it is still fun to speculate about. Number 9, Mr. Pink's new job. Okay, staying on wacky fan theories for just a second. So, the only person who makes it out of Reservoir Dogs alive is Mr. Pink, and while it is implied that he is gunned down as soon as he leaves the warehouse, what if he did survive? What if Mr. Pink managed a second miraculous escape of the day, and after the entire ordeal with the diamonds was just put off a life of crime? Consequently, an unskilled worker with absolutely no experience then turns to the only job that he can find, which is a waiter slash Buddy Holly impersonator at Jackrabbit Slims. Because Steve Buscemi, of course, plays Mr. Pink in this movie and has a cameo in Pulp Fiction as the Buddy Holly waiter, maybe it's not as ridiculous as this first appears. Number 8, what happened to Mr. Pink's diamonds? With the heist hitting the fan almost immediately, the bulk of the movie mainly becomes about survival. Mr. Pink, however, does claim that he did retrieve a bag of diamonds from the heist, even though the audience never actually sees them. So what actually happened to these diamonds by the end of the movie? Well, we're back into fan theory territory, but one that has raged for decades now. This, of course, is the fan theory that suggests that these are actually what was in the briefcase that Vincent and Jules took for Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction. It's just a minor detail in Reservoir Dogs itself, but it's taken on a life of its own in the years since. Number 7, Five Guys. Joe's plan to rob a diamond store in broad daylight required the use of trusted professionals. However, it seems like Joe himself forgot about how many guys he was hiring for the job. At first, he tells Larry that it's a 5-man job, despite the fact that there are clearly 6 people wearing the black suits. This is explained away later though, as Mr. Blonde wasn't added until later on in the heist planning. And yet, when Joe actually has his team together and is giving his instructions, he loses count of his men once again. He reels off the aliases of Mr. Brown, Mr. White, Mr. Blonde, Mr. Blue, Mr. Orange, and Mr. Pink, before then referencing that there are 5 men carrying out the job. He literally just went through a roll call of 6 names, and then says that if anything goes wrong, it'll be 5 men in a bullpen. Now this mistake is reportedly because actor Lawrence Tierney misspoke during the scene, but if you look at the line in the vacuum of the movie, did he subconsciously know or at least suspect that one of his guys was a cop and couldn't join the rest of him in prison? Probably not, but it does kind of maybe explain it as a kind of spooky prescience that this character has. Number 6, Mr. Orange is a comics nerd. In showing how a cop called Freddy prepared for the biggest and final role in his life, Tarantino delved into the backstory of who he is and what he was all about. And one of the biggest aspects of this character, weirdly, was his love of Marvel Comics. Don't believe me? There is evidence all around his scenes. Of course, there is the obvious big Silver Surfer poster next to his mirror when he convinces himself that the crew doesn't suspect a thing, but there's still more. In Another Thing, he likens Joe to the Thing from the Fantastic Four, and then there are also Iron Man and Thing action figures that can be seen around his coffee table. So yeah, who knows, if Mr. Orange survived and decided he didn't want to be a cop anymore, he might have been working for WhatCulture.com in another 10, 15 years. Number 5, the swinging door. In the warehouse where the bulk of the movie takes place, the door at the far end that anyone who comes in and out uses reportedly just kept swinging open on the day. This was such an issue that it apparently caused havoc in shots where the door was supposed to be closed. And while most of these were edited around, there is one scene where the issue is in the final cut and the actors just roll with it. In one scene, Harvey Keitel strode across the room amid conversation with Chris Penn and Michael Madsen, shut the door, and then walked back without skipping a single beat. The moment wasn't planned, it was just incorporated into the scene naturally, and Tarantino decided to keep it in. Number 4, conversations in the mirror. The connection between Mr. Orange and Mr. White, of course, works as the emotional heart of Reservoir Dogs. It's never fully explored why White had such a connection to Orange, but they do have a few things in common that are shown in the film. Aside from both being fearless, the two have a similar relationship with themselves in that they both sought some sort of comfort, confidence, or reassurance from talking to themselves in the mirror. For Mr. White, it's when he was telling Mr. Pink about the last job he had that was infiltrated by an undercover cop, while for Mr. Orange, it was about psyching himself up just before he went to meet the actual people on the job. Number 3, the true value of the wedding ring. For the most part, Freddy is shown to be a pretty good actor when he's performing his role while he's undercover. He meticulously rehearses his story about the drug deal gone wrong, and there's also the tiny detail of his wedding ring, which he slips on every time he's playing the character and seeing the other guys. The ring is never mentioned outright, though just before he goes out to Eddie's car, he turns back into his apartment to retrieve it from a tray of loose change. As Freddy, he never wears the ring, but as Mr. Orange, he's never without it. It's obviously an important part of his cover story. And though it is invaluable in protecting his story, the true value of the wedding ring cannot be shown by the fact that he just keeps it in the same regard as likely less than $1's worth of spare change. That's how little it means to him as an actual person. Number 2, the colored bottles. After the opening credits, the movie kicks into overdrive, immediately picking up with the heist gone wrong. And while White and Pink head into a different room to the screaming and panicking Mr. Orange, they enter into a somewhat heated discussion over who the rat could be. Had they just turned around and looked at the bottles right behind them, though, they might have had a little bit of a suggestion to help them figure out that Mr. Orange was, of course, the rat. See, in this scene, there were 3 colours of bottles, white, pink, and orange, exactly the same as the aliases of the men at the warehouse. On the left, there were white and pink together with a big gap between them, and the orange on its own on the right. Clearly, orange was different from the others because Mr. Orange was a cop. Number 1, Mr. White sat between Joe and Mr. Orange. One of the biggest threads throughout the movie is that none of these men are supposed to know each other. That's the whole point of the aliases in the first place. However, that's not entirely true. See, Mr. White knew Joe, while Mr. Blonde was very close with both Joe and his son Eddie. Even outside of this, there was a certain relationship that was sparking between Mr. White and Mr. Orange, so much so that the former defended the latter with his life. When Joe rocks up to the warehouse later on in the movie, he's absolutely sure that Mr. Orange is the rat that he's looking for. But in this scene, of course, Mr. White stands between them because he doesn't want to see his friend killed for something that he doesn't believe to be true. And this was telegraphed right at the very beginning of the movie when the men are sitting around the table eating, as Mr. White is situated right between Joe and Mr. Orange, just as he would be in the standoff at the very end of the film. So, that's our list. Want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. How many of these details did you pick up on when you watched Reservoir Dogs? And what do you think about the few fan theories that were thrown in there as well? Let me know, and while you're down there, could you please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to whatculture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.